Hello everybody and welcome to our studies in AQA A-Level History. This is the first video in a series covering the Tudor module, specifically looking at Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth. This first video is going to examine the first part of the AQA specification, namely the consolidation of power of Henry Tudor, his character and aims, and the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. Now, fundamentally then, we start our understanding of this history at a point at which England is going through a quite tumultuous period. Now, you don't have to know really anything that much about the Wars of the Roses, but fundamentally the Wars of the Roses, beginning in around 1450, was a period of history in which you have rival factions, divided between Lancastrian and Yorkist factions that are vying for control and authority. It's basically a civil war that is taking place within England. Now, at the time at which Henry VII comes into the picture, or Henry Tudor comes into the picture, we are looking at the reign of Richard III. And ultimately, the consolidation of power for Henry VII was after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Now, some people suggest that his full victory and his full consolidation of power takes place a little bit after that, because he has to deal with some pretenders and some threats to his reign. We'll get to that in a second. But fundamentally, he becomes king at the day of the Battle of Bosworth. But he faces numerous challenges in consolidating his power. England had been, historically, for a few decades at that point, going through a tumultuous period, a conflict internally. And so the idea that Henry Tudor would just rock up onto the stage and would ultimately take control and everything will be fine is, of course, a bit of a pipe dream. And so in reality, he had to face a number of challenges when it came to consolidating his power. So beginning first then, when we think about Henry VII, from the perspective of history, we think of him as obviously the individual who consolidated the Tudor dynasty. And then we think about, of course, his ability to allow for his succession and to get essentially arguably the most famous of all the monarchs in English history, that being Henry VIII, his son, on the throne. But at the time, his claim to the throne was relatively weak. He was a distant descendant of Edward III, and he was a distant descendant through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Her lineage was linked to the illegitimate Beaufort family, but despite this, Henry's claim was strengthened by the fact that he was seen as a figure who potentially could unite warring factions, since at the time, the Yorkist king, King Richard III, was relatively unpopular. We also have the fact that he was not meant to be king, his nephews were meant to be king, and we see a period of time in which those two princes disappeared mysteriously before they came of age, and he conveniently became king. Of course, we don't know what happened to the princes in the Tower. We suspect that Richard III probably killed the prince in the Tower. Of course, there are many Richard III supporters who argue that that is not the case, but again, there's more evidence points towards the traditional reading of the history. But then, fundamentally then, we can see that there is an unpopularity with Richard III. We have, despite the fact that he had a relatively weak claim, Henry Tudor, who may present a claim to the throne that could bring about stability, given his sort of inactivity out of the way of the sort of Wars of the Roses. Henry VII's character was marked by caution and pragmatism. And we can see this quite a lot in a lot of his reign. We'll see this when we look at his foreign policy. We will see this when we look at his economic policy. We will look at his finances. He was very pragmatic. He was very cautious. He was very, very concerned with the consolidation of his dynasty. Now, he was not an overly charismatic or imposing figure like that of Richard III, but he was shrewd and politically astute. Henry was determined to establish a stable rule and avoid the mistakes of his predecessors. And so the result is that his aim is to restore stability in England, and so he takes a very cautious approach to pretty much all of his policies. And if we think about his most arguably unpopular policy, you would argue that his desire for financial security, the aim to strengthen the monarchy financially, with the view that essentially his predecessors, who had depleted the royal coffers through war and ineffective taxation, failed because of that reason. He wanted to make sure that he was the one who was in control of the majority of England's finances, more so than any of his nobles. And so he introduced measures that would boost the monarchy's finances, including a very prudent management of royal land, the limiting of court expenditures, and the securing of regular revenue streams through taxation, and the reorganisation of crown estates, some of which become very, very unpopular when we start to think about the council learned in the next lesson. We'll see that these taxation policies are particularly unpopular and result in the execution of his two sort of financiers, Edmund and Dudley, in the reign of Henry VIII. We'll get to that as well. Ultimately then, the solidification of Henry VII's reign takes place with the Battle of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth, of course, took place on the 22nd of August 1485 and was against, of course, Richard III, the last of the Yorkist monarchs. Henry's forces, which included a mixture of Lancastrians and some mercenaries, were also supported by a number of disaffected Yorkist nobles. So, for example, Sir William Stanley and his brother Lord Thomas Stanley, whose intervention in the battle was particularly decisive. We'll get to those in future lessons as well. But ultimately, Richard III was killed during the battle, and Henry's victory marked the end of the Wars of the Roses. Now, most historians would argue that it was the Battle of Bosworth that marked the end of the Wars of the Roses. Some historians might also put the end of the Wars of the Roses to be roughly around the Battle of Stokesfield with the insurgency of Lambert Simnel, which we'll get to in a minute. Regardless, if the Battle of Bosworth was not the formal end of the Wars of the Roses, it was definitely the beginning of the end of the Wars of the Roses, because Henry was very astute. He was very clever when it came to securing his dynasty. At the time then, on the 23rd of August, let's say, the day after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, his rule was not entirely secure. Because from that perspective, and at that time, this was just another one of those times in which we see the Lancastrian line of succession taking the throne against the Yorkists, and this was just a continuation of the Wars of the Roses. Many Yorkist supporters still remained, especially up in the north, and so the legitimacy of his reign was particularly a matter of dispute. And so the consolidation of power was a very important aspect of this event. There were a number of things that he does to consolidate his power. I've listed here 4 in my notes. The first is the securing of loyalty through acts of attainder. After the Battle of Bosworth, Henry needed to secure loyalty from the nobility, those who controlled a lot of the land, who controlled a lot of the revenue, particularly the nobility who supported Richard III. He achieved this by passing what were known as acts of attainder. Essentially, this declared certain nobles, mainly Yorkist nobles who had fought against him, as traitors. But he also granted pardons to those who submitted to him and who swore loyalty. Essentially, what he did was he dated his reign the 21st of August 1485, the day before the Battle of Bosworth, so as to legitimate any claims of treacherousness by essentially anybody who fought against him. And he was able to pass these acts of attainder in that way. Now, it created a mix of fear and loyalty, as those who could potentially pose a threat to him were either removed from power, they were stripped of a lot of title, they were stripped of a lot of revenue, and therefore made very much weakened by these acts themselves. To solidify his claim, What Henry ensured was that his coronation would occur before the first meeting of his parliament. His coronation occurred in October. The first meeting of his parliament occurred in November. The act was very significant because essentially what it did was place his authority as that of a divine right, rather than one that is a right to rule by force, or a right to rule through parliamentary approval. It signified very clearly that his authority came from God, and it did not come from Parliament. And so we see that the date of his coronation is very strategically planned to be just before the meeting of his parliament, implying that he was the legitimate ruler chosen by God and not merely some kind of usurper. Another key strategy to consolidating his power was in 1486, after he had firstly put Elizabeth of York in the Tower of London, had arrested her. He then also chose to marry her, the daughter of Edward IV. And theoretically the rightful heir to the Yorkist throne. So Elizabeth of York theoretically symbolised a major threat to his legitimacy as king, but the marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolises a unification of the warring factions, the sort of theoretical merging of the Lancastrian and the Yorkists to help gain some of the support from the Yorkist loyalists. We also see that by marrying into this family, by marrying Elizabeth of York, Henry was able to strengthen his legitimacy of his claim. So, and then when it comes to when they have children, their children would have a strong connection to both the Lancastrian lines and the Yorkist lines of succession. Again, a formal ending to the Wars of the Roses. He also secures his heir. The birth of his first son, Arthur Tudor, took place in 1486 and was crucial for securing the Tudor dynasty's future. Arthur was the heir apparent, and his birth helped to reassure both the English nobility and the population that this new Tudor dynasty was now to be established and that would continue after Henry's death. If he was unable to secure his heir, if he was unable to have children, for example, then there would be a major problem, because upon the death of Henry VII in 1509, the Wars of the Roses would likely have just continued and picked back up again. It would have been a sort of period of relative stability during the war, in the Wars of the Roses during his reign, and then it will be back to the same old debate because there would be no heir. We also see that he reorganises and establishes his Tudor dynasty. His consolidation of power also involves a careful reorganisation of, for example, his royal court. He built up a loyal network of administrators, many of whom came from the gentry rather than the old noble families. Again, this was to try and limit the power of potential rival noble families. These men were loyal because of their advancement under him. Key figures were, for example, his trusted advisors, such as Sir Reginald Bray and Richard Empson, who became very, very key in the reorganisation of his royal finances, particularly. Furthermore, we can see that Henry worked very closely with Parliament to solidify his authority. He only calls Parliament a number of times, I believe 7 times throughout his entire reign. The majority of those were in the first half of his reign. But when he does call Parliament, it's very clear that he's using Parliament for his own purposes, and he's using Parliament to strengthen his position and to limit the power of any potential challengers. So, for example, the Act of Resumption in 1486 allows him to reclaim lands that had been granted away by Richard III, again reinforcing the crown's financial strength, reinforcing Henry's control over the nobility, and delegitimizing the authority and the legitimacy of Richard III. Despite all this, then, there were still problems, and we do see a number of pretenders to the throne, a number of people who tried to continue the Wars of the Roses, who saw it as just a minor setback, and so decided that they would try and take the throne from him. So, Theoretically and effectively, the Battle of Bosworth does end the Wars of the Roses, but there was still a number of pretenders that were often backed by factions within England and also some foreign powers. We're going to get to Margaret of Burgundy quite a lot in this particular next next section. Now, the first, arguably the most important, probably the most important of these pretenders to the throne was that of Lambert Simnel in 1487. Now, he was one of the most notable pretenders because he claimed to be Edward, the Earl of Warwick, who had been at the time imprisoned in the Tower of London. Now, the real Earl of Warwick was a legitimate claimant to the throne through his parental descent from Edward III, and so he was able to theoretically challenge Henry, which is why Henry put the real Earl of Warwick in the Tower of London. Now, the origins of this are in 1486, when Simnel, who was just a boy from Oxfordshire, was promoted as the pretender by John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, who was the cousin of Richard III. John de la Pole theoretically had a strong claim to the throne himself as the cousin of Richard III, but instead the Earl of Lincoln was involved in the attempt to essentially use Lambert Simnel to present him as a stronger claim to the throne. In fact, Lincoln had been involved in a rebellion in the early 1480s after Richard III's death, and he sought to, as a way to try and capitalise on this chaos. So Simnel was to be presented as the Earl of Warwick, and this was essentially as an attempt to pretend to be this individual. Now, of course, this is the 1400s. There were no phones, there was no social media, there was no TV, so anybody in England would not have a clue what the real Earl of Warwick looked like. And so it was very easy to pretend to be somebody, and especially if you have a society, especially up in the north, who wanted this person to be the Earl of Warwick, then of course they're going to buy into that more effectively. John de la Pole, for example, the Earl of Lincoln, probably didn't really care if they were the Earl of Warwick or not, because they were able to control them, because Simnel was a boy from Oxfordshire. Now, Simnel's claim was to be supported by the deposed Irish king, the Earl of Kildare, and also to be supported by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and particularly, specifically, the sister of Richard III, who was Margaret of Burgundy. Margaret of Burgundy would offer support to a number of pretenders against Henry VII. You can understand why. Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Richard III, gets news that her brother has been killed by Henry VII. She wants to overthrow Henry VII. And through the sort of tacit support of Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire, we can see that there is quite a lot of foreign support for Henry, for any pretender against Henry VII. All of this comes to a head in 1487 at the Battle of Stokesfield, where Henry's forces defeated the rebels. Now, the Earl of Lincoln, the primary backer of Simnel, was killed in the battle, and what Henry VII did was display Simnel publicly afterwards, sparing his life and forcing him to work in the royal kitchens. In addition to this, he publicly displayed the Earl of Warwick to show everybody that the Earl of Warwick, the real Earl of Warwick, was in fact in the Tower of London, and that he was a pretender, that Simnel was a pretender. But ultimately, the Battle of Stokesfield was not necessarily a battle that Henry thought he would win. It was not as confident, it was not as secure in his victory as you might think. Remember, it was only August of 1485 that he takes the throne with the Battle of Bosworth. And so it was only about a year, just over a year, maybe a year and a half, until there is another major force rebelling against him and trying to take the throne in battle. But it was a significant victory, and we can see that essentially the Battle of Stokesfield does, for most historians, definitely formally end the Wars of the Roses. Between 1491 and 1499, we have one of the most persistent and potentially serious pretenders to Henry VII's throne, and this is Perkin Warbeck. Now, Perkin Warbeck claimed to be a number of people, including Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, the younger son of Edward IV. Richard, along with his brother Edward V, had been imprisoned in the Tower of London during the reign of Richard III. Now, both disappeared. Both Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Now, we know that, I believe, under the reign of James I from 1603 to 1625, there was the discovery of bones in the Tower of London, which we presume are the young princes in the Tower, but they have not been identified. There's not been DNA testing, and it's basically up to the royal family at the time to whether or not to do any kind of DNA analysis on these individuals. And Elizabeth II, for the majority of her reign, rejected the calls to basically exhume these bodies and to do DNA examinations. We might see that change under Charles III now, but maybe it will remain a mystery forever who and what happened to the princes in the Tower. But Perkin Warbeck then was a persistent threat to Henry's throne, and ultimately, just like with Lambert Simnel, could claim to be whoever he so chose. He could claim to be Richard of Shrewsbury, because nobody really knew what Richard of Shrewsbury looked like. Nobody has seen the Princes of the Tower since the reign of Richard III, and so they could make the claim that they have just come out and are in fact alive, and are going to try and claim the throne from Henry. Warbeck first appeared then in Ireland in 1491, again claiming to be the Duke of York, Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two princes in the Tower. He would soon gain support from the wife of Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire, Margaret of Burgundy, who was, of course, just very sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, given that she was the brother of Richard III. She had also supported Lambert Simnel, and therefore was going to provide financial support to Warbeck and his soldiers. Ultimately, like I said already, it does not really matter what Margaret of Burgundy thought of the true Perkin Warbeck, whether or not she genuinely believed he was one of the princes in the Tower. She just wanted Henry VII gone. Warbeck was recognised by a number of European courts. He ended up in France, he was in Burgundy at one point, he was in Scotland at one point. Initially, the French king, Charles VIII, offered him support and shelter. He also managed to get some support in Scotland as well. Now, Warbeck attempted to land in England over a number of occasions. He gained some support in 1495, he then came in 1497, with varying degrees of success, but none of which being successful in overthrowing Henry. His most significant attempt was probably in 1497, when he landed in Cornwall and tried to essentially take advantage of and utilize the Cornish rebellion to take the throne. Of course, many people during the Cornish rebellion didn't really care about the dynastic threat that Warbeck faced to Henry. They were more interested in the fact that Henry was imposing taxation policies. And so Henry's forces very quickly defeated him, and he was captured. He was eventually imprisoned in the Tower of London and initially treated relatively leniently, but in 1499 he and probably the Earl of Warwick attempted to escape, and he was therefore executed. Finally then, from 1499 to after the reign of Henry VII in 1513, you have the attempt, again, a serious contender to the throne, by Edmund Deapole, the nephew of Richard III and the son of the Duke of Suffolk. He was a member of the Deapole family, of course, who had significant Yorkist connections. He had initially been loyal to Henry VII, but started to become disillusioned with the Tudor rule later on in life. His elder brother was John Deapole, who had supported Lambert Simnel and who had been killed at the Battle of Stokesfield. Now, he sought refuge in the court of Maximilian I, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, after tensions with Henry VII in 1499. Again, and the emperor encouraged his claim to the throne, hoping again it would destabilise the position of Henry. But in 1506, he was handed over to Henry VII by the emperor. He was then imprisoned in the Tower of London and would then be executed by Henry VIII in 1513, when he succeeded his father to the throne. And so ultimately then, there are a number of different instances in which Henry was facing threats to his dynastic reign, and there are a number of different things he did to try and attempt to consolidate his power. The theme of consolidation and the theme of dynasty and the theme of succession is something that we're going to see quite a lot throughout these videos on Henry VII. This is what he was obsessed with. His government, his council, his royal finance was all around the idea of securing dynasty and securing stability. So too was his foreign policy. So too was his relationship with society and his economic developments, all of which we'll explore in future lessons.